I would like to introduce Professor Robert Fox again, who already did one thing yesterday in my Harlem Renaissance class, and I welcome the majority of the people here are from my Harlem Renaissance course. But it's better that I will tell you a few things about him. He is a professor of English and Africana Studies at Southern Illinois University at Carbondale, Illinois, educated at Cornell, Berkeley, and the State University of New York at Buffalo. From 1978 to 1985, that's 7 years, he taught at the University of Ife in Nigeria. And I would also like to introduce his spouse, who is Nigerian. And I think you met there at that time?
Yes.
Okay. He has written two books, Conscientious Sorcerers, 1987, Masters of the Drum, 1995. Maybe you could later on mention what these books are about. Fox has been a visiting scholar at the W.E. Du Bois Institute for African American Research at Harvard University. That's sort of the most outstanding research place in the United States on African American stuff. And he has been a recipient of a senior fellowship from the American Council of Learned Societies and a USIA sponsored and he was a USIA sponsored lecturer in India. And then I think I might just, if you don't steal it, I might just pass this around. He just published a volume of poems, Masks of Light. And in connection with that, and I think I mentioned that in my class, if you think you might be a budding poet or something, or if you just want to see if you can write poetry, the last event that we've organized for him is tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, right here again, and it's a poetry workshop. So he'll read some of his poetry, but then whatever. I don't know how. I've never done a poetry workshop. I've only noticed that sometimes you encourage people to do instantaneous poems and then read them out loud. And I'm very happy that you could spend the time with us. And
I am too.
I pass it around. But I want to have it back. Don't steal it. Did you have some today, or is that for tomorrow? But you said you had some.
No, that's for tomorrow.
For tomorrow. Okay. No problem.
All right. Well, thank you, Professor Sander. I'm very pleased to be here. This is my first time in Puerto Rico, and probably way past due because I do work in Caribbean literature, and this is my first time south of the United States. The title of my talk today is Claude McKay and the Africa Question. The Africa Question is, I guess, why did someone who was a global individual, a person of African descent who traveled very widely, not go to sub-Saharan Africa? And I'm going to answer I'm going to talk about that question because it's difficult to answer precisely, but this is something you might want to think about for a possible discussion afterwards, because I think that looming over the question of why Claude McKay didn't visit sub-Saharan Africa is another larger question, which is why should we be asking why? This is, I think, the key question that presumably Claude McKay himself could be asking us. So, I begin with a quote from McKay. Leaving America in 1922, he said, "Go, better than stand still, keep going." Claude McKay spent time in North Africa, but never visited sub-Saharan Africa. I want to probe some of the factors that contributed to or helped to explain this circumstance. Pursuing this issue, it is important to keep in mind that unlike many offspring of the Middle Passage, McKay knew with some certainty where his ancestors came from. According to Tyrone Tillery, McKay's father Thomas was a descendant of the West African nation of Ashanti and often held the family transfixed, telling wonderful stories of African traditions and customs. Wayne Cooper, author of an earlier, more substantial biography of McKay, is somewhat less definite. He writes that McKay believed his father to be of Ashanti origin. He remembered that his father knew certain Ashanti customs and remembered stories of Africa, which he related to his family. The title of Tillery's book, Claude McKay, A Black Poet's Struggle for Identity, might prompt us to ask whether, from McKay's perspective, that struggle necessitated an engagement with Africa, and if so, at what level? For a number of reasons, this is not an easy question to answer. Part of the problem stems from the fact that McKay was such a complex individual. Let us recall the subtitle of Paul Gilroy's book on the Black Atlantic, Modernity and Double Consciousness. This is central in coming to grips with McKay, who was actively engaged with modernity. I'll have more to say about this a little bit later, and who can be seen as manifesting double consciousness on a number of levels. Indeed, double consciousness almost seems inadequate as an explanation or description of McKay's composite personality, just as the Black Atlantic ultimately, I think, is too concise a frame for containing his experience. Consider this capsule profile of McKay. He loved both women and men. He honored the pastoral. His father was a farmer, and when McKay first came to the U.S., he studied agriculture at Tuskegee and Kansas State universities. But he also wrote a series of sonnets celebrating the cities he lived in. He was an intellectual who, however, disliked the intelligentsia, and a vagabond, or as he called himself, a troubadour wanderer. He was a poet and a prose writer, best known today as a poet. His novel Home to Harlem, 1928, made him the first black writer to reach the bestseller list. He was a master both of the vernacular and standard English. He published 2 books of poetry in Jamaican patois before he left for the United States. He's a foremost influence on the founders of the Negritude movement, who, however, didn't fully embrace that philosophy. McKay was proud of his blackness. "I feel quite proud of my black African face," he wrote in a poem from 1943, but he wasn't a black nationalist or any sort of nationalist. He described himself as an internationalist, but he might more accurately be termed a transnationalist. He believed that the American Negro group is the most advanced in the world, but that it sadly lacks a group soul. I think that many African Americans would beg to differ with him on that subject. He was an Anglophile who became an Anglophobe, a communist who became a conservative, an atheist who ended up converting to Catholicism. Then consider the following statement from Paul Gilroy's book Against Race, which was his follow-up to the Black Atlantic. Quote, "The tensions around origin and essence that the diaspora brings into view allow us to perceive that identity should not be fossilized in keeping with the holy spirit of ethnic absolutism. Identity, too, becomes a noun of process." In his autobiography, A Long Way from Home, McKay tells how he was accosted one day while living in Morocco and asked if he was an American. "I said I was born in the West Indies and lived in the United States, and that I was an American even though I was a British subject, but I preferred to think of myself as an internationalist." Most commentaries focus on McKay's use of the term internationalist, which is where McKay himself places the emphasis, explaining, "I had said I was an internationalist just by way of a joke, without missing its radical implications, because at that time an internationalist was a euphemism for being a communist." But I'm interested in the significance of his identification of himself as an American, despite his status as a British subject. He was a British subject by birth, an American by choice. But he also was American by virtue of geographical location, an inhabitant of the Americas, the New World. After all, Columbus's initial discovery in 1492 of what came to be known as America occurred in the Caribbean. McKay's initial move to the United States in 1912 occurred on the cusp of the Great Migration of African Americans from the south to the north, from rural areas to urban centers. He had already made a similar journey on a smaller scale within Jamaica, from the countryside to the town and the city. Robert Bone refers to this as a process of deprovincialization. McKay's subsequent widespread travels, beginning with his trip to England in 1919, would extend that process onto an international scale. The trajectory of McKay's movements transformed him from country boy to cosmopolitan, took him from the parochial to the transnational. McKay's life and work, in fact, could be placed in the category of the literature and experience of what one scholar has called migritude. Reading McKay in singular terms often is to misread him, to fail to do justice to the fullness of his character and the range of his influence. I agree with Wayne Cooper that, quote, "The place of Negroes in the modern world was the one great problem that obsessed McKay from his arrival in the United States until his death," unquote. But even in this instance, McKay didn't settle on one solution to this problem, although he did have faith in the resiliency and creativity and the soul, if you will, of black folk. In his introduction to the Pluto Press edition of McKay's autobiography, St. Clair Drake describes McKay's experience in Marseille and Morocco and then states, quote, but neither southern France nor North Africa was home. He did not have a chance to travel below the Sahara in the ancestral homeland which he romanticized in some of his poetry. Drake's statement raises a number of issues that demand careful attention, in particular because he's an eminent scholar of the diaspora. Certainly it is true that McKay's home was neither in France nor North Africa, although there is something to think about in Michael North's idea that McKay was capable of being at home everywhere. In the sense that most people would understand the term, home for McKay was first Jamaica, where he was born, and spent the first 23 years of his life. In his 1912 dialect poem, My Native Land, My Home, McKay says of Jamaica, although dem call we no land race, I know we home is here. And in My Mountain Home, also from the same year, 1912, he declares, in days to come I shall return to end my wandering there. He never did. His second home was the United States, where he lived for many years, acquired citizenship in 1940, and died in 1948. And although McKay returned to Jamaica in his writings, several of the stories in the collection Gingertown and Banana Bottom, generally considered to be his finest novel, and the unfinished autobiographical work My Green Hills of Jamaica, published posthumously in 1979, he never did physically return to the place in which he was born. Robert Bone writes that Banana Bottom and the Jamaican stories in Gingertown mark the outer limits of McKay's flight from the West. And Bone says, the flight was doomed because the fugitive was fleeing from himself. Well, there's a sense in which, at a profound psychological level, this may be true of all artists. But without plunging that deep, I believe that in McKay's case, his flight was aimed toward a geography or circumstance that would allow him to be free to be himself. He wasn't fleeing from himself, he was actually looking for the ability to be free to be who he was. It is necessary to keep in mind that there's a significant difference between home and ancestral homeland, although Sinclair Drake seems in Afrocentric fashion to collapse the two terms. If McKay experienced exile, what William J. Maxwell calls a mandatory drifting or a forced black Atlanticism, it was not due to a longing for or an inability to reclaim an ancestral homeland. Indeed, as Phil Cohen observes, in the case of writers for whom diaspora has been good to think with, an interesting turn of phrase, exile is not a sign of bondage or self-alienation, but of freedom from constraint. So writing in 1964, Wayne Cooper asks, why did McKay spend 12 years wandering through Europe and North Africa? And then answers his own question by referring to McKay's well-known statement in A Long Way from Home that his restlessness was due to color consciousness. We know now, however, that McKay remained abroad for so long because both the British and the United States governments considered him a dangerous radical and barred him from either returning to the United States or Jamaica or from entering other British territories. Eventually, due to some intercessions on his behalf in 1934, McKay was able to return to the United States for good. It remains unclear whether he would have been able thereafter to visit Jamaica or whether, since he never did make such a visit, he made a deliberate choice to avoid homecoming. And that's still a question about McKay. He had married a woman early on, had a daughter with her. The marriage broke up. The wife moved back to Jamaica with the daughter, and then McKay, as far as I know, never saw his daughter during his lifetime. Even though he may have been prevented from visiting the African portions of Britain's empire, it's not clear that McKay had no it's not true that McKay had no opportunities to visit sub-Saharan Africa. His strongest interest lay elsewhere, apparently. Nevertheless, Josh Goshiak's parenthetical comment in his otherwise excellent work of scholarship, The Shadowed Country, and it's a parenthetical comment, Africa meant little to him, though he spoke as Afrique's son, dramatically understates the case. McKay, in fact, had a serious interest in Africa. Given the nature of his radicalism, scarcely could have been otherwise. Michel Fabre describes McKay as a third world partisan before the term existed, and notes that he refused on moral grounds to set foot in Italy because of the Ethiopian War. While William J. Maxwell informs us that on his first trip to England in 1919, McKay consulted with radical African students. But McKay was not caught up in what we might call the roots phenomenon. As noted above, he was generally aware of his roots. nor was he a supporter of the Back to Africa movement. As far as romanticizing the homeland, while it is true that many of the poems of the Harlem Renaissance depicted an idealized Africa that is the homeland and mother of Afro-Americans, his approach is quite different. His willingness to chart his own path, actually, I think is one of his most characteristic traits. In his 1921 poem, Africa, he praises the African past, but the references to pyramids and Pharaoh make it clear he was referring to ancient Egypt, which in alignment with Afrocentric thought he portrays as having been a great civilization when the rest of the world dwelled in obscurity. But McKay goes on in the poem to delineate a precipitous fall from past glory. Quote, "The darkness swallowed thee again. Now thy time is done." Is Egypt here a metonym for the continent as a whole, as Ethiopia is in certain contexts? So the title implies. Then, is the entire African continent dark in McKay's estimation? No. But McKay does believe Africa has declined and gone into a slumber. An earlier poem entitled Exhortation from 1920, in which he cries out, "Africa, long ages sleeping, O my motherland, awake," shows McKay clearly was concerned with Africa's future, its liberation from oppression. It is noteworthy, however, that it is not the West that McKay imagines is bringing about Africa's rise. "O my brothers," he cries, "to the East turn your eyes." He is alluding here to the 1917 Russian Revolution. Indeed, in 1922, McKay went to Russia to experience the results of this transformation, one of the first black people ever to do so. In his autobiography, he referred to this journey as the magic pilgrimage. He also informed his readers that, quote, "In Moscow, they had published a cartoon of me sailing on a magic carpet over the African jungles to the miracle of the Soviet." It seems odd that McKay, who was fascinated by proletarian revolution, would employ a phrase like magic pilgrimage to describe his trip to Russia. The cartoon he refers to is more understandable, given the fact that apparently even revolution could not overcome long-standing notions of exoticism with regard to blackness. That a magic carpet derives from the Arabian Nights and has nothing to do with sub-Saharan Africa, let alone a black man from the diaspora, aptly conveys the confusion and condescension that race thinking displays. Moreover, the atavism of that cartoon is underscored by a comment that Marjorie Perloff quotes in her book on the Futurist movement. "Neither the 7-league boots and the flying carpets of fairy tale nor the wings of Icarus could match the real means of transportation that were now invented." The most incredible of these, of course, was the airplane. In 1919, the first transatlantic flights had taken place, and in 1923, the first nonstop flight across the United States was made in less than 27 hours. The airplane was a prime example of the technological idolatry of futurism. Although Russian futurism, which focused on the visual arts and literature and thus was narrow in scope than Italian futurism, was in decline by the time that McKay made his visit. McKay wasn't a futurist, but he was interested in futurity. According to Maxim Matusevich, while in Russia, McKay was offered an airplane ride over Petrograd. And indeed, the cover of the Pluto Press edition of A Long Way From Home features a photograph of McKay in post-revolutionary Russia, taken in March 1923, in the aircraft in which he made the flight. And thanks to the good graces of Professor Sander, who did some research for me, I actually have that original photo. And what's interesting is it's a ski plane. I'm going to pass this around. The cover of the book, however, was cropped in such a way that I couldn't tell what kind of vehicle it was, and I took a guess that it was an aircraft. And in fact, he was able to prove that for me, so I'm going to pass this around. I think it's a fascinating photo. McKay is the fellow in the center there. Still, the image of Claude McKay, a black man being transported above Africa to Russia, is an apposite one when it is recognized that there has long been a black presence there. Although African slaves were brought to the Black Sea region of Russia beginning in the 16th century, it is widely known today that Alexander Pushkin, Russia's most revered poet, was the grandson of Ibrahim Hannibal, an African servant. He actually was an engineer in the court of Tsar Peter the Great. And there's more documentation that I could give you, but in the interest of time, I'll skip it. But that's, again, one of the reasons why I think the notion of a black Atlantic, as important as it is a little bit reductive. because there are black people on the Pacific coast, for instance, of South America. There are black people in Russia and India and places like that. It's a long way from the Atlantic. So the diaspora is very widely cast. Much broader experience than most people have given it credit for. One of the things that I think we have to remind ourselves of is that when McKay was wandering the world, it was actually an earlier period of globalization. The Oxford English Dictionary gives 1930 as the earliest date for the use of the term globalization, but the phenomenon actually predates that coinage. There's another quote from another journal. This actually dates back to 1904. Now, the opening of the 20th century is appropriate as the end of a great historical epoch. The world in its remoter borders has hardly been revealed before we must chronicle its complete appropriation. There are no longer any gaps in the political or cultural possession of the Earth's surface, et cetera, et cetera. So people at the beginning of the 21st century, more than 100 years ago, or 20th century, excuse me, were actually noting the fact that globalization was taking place. And Marjorie Perloff notes that in 1913, the first signal transmitted around the world was sent from the Eiffel Tower in Paris, thus establishing a global network that seemed to promise what the painters and the poets were to call simultaneity. So, even though I don't necessarily agree with Frederick Jameson's insistence that we must always historicize, knowing something about history is quite important and can help us to change our perspective a little bit, which seems increasingly to be more and more truncated as we move into the future. So Claude McKay ends up in Morocco, where he spends a lot of time. So why Morocco? For one thing, it constituted what Gauchiac calls a porous opening between East and West, Africa and the Orient. Significantly, it was also the place where, McKay informs us, quote, "For the first time in my life, I felt myself singularly free of color consciousness," unquote. On the previous page of his autobiography, he confessed that the mosaics of Morocco went to my head like rare wine. I read this as a reference not only to the actual mosaics that McKay saw, but also as a metaphoric statement of his delight in the human mosaic which he discovered in Moroccan society. Earlier in this same work, as already noted, McKay famously specifies color consciousness as the fundamental reason of his restlessness. Yet this very restlessness propelled him on a journey that eventually led him to a place where he feels he has escaped color consciousness. And yet, one wonders, how free from color consciousness was a society like Morocco with its mixtures of peoples, European, Arabic, African? McKay entitled the last section of his autobiography, The Idyls, I-D-Y-L-L-S, of Africa. In the first chapter of this section, entitled When a Negro Goes Native, he writes of a desire to go to Africa where he might go on a one-man search party, since he was not big and white enough to go on a big game hunt. In any event, a man from Martinique, who McKay said had visited every big port in Africa but preferred Morocco, invited him to Casablanca, where he had settled. McKay eventually did go to Casablanca, but first he went to Spain, where he stayed long enough to become aware of the strong African streak in its character. As Guy Reynolds has pointed out, McKay understood Spain as a transitional site. When he finally ran into his Martinican acquaintance again, and was made again the offer to go to Morocco, he was more interested, and so he did go. He stayed there for 6 months. In a letter written from Paris in September of 1929, McKay told a friend, "I had a wonderful time of it in Africa, living among the Arabs and making friends. I did not want to leave if it were not that the French are masters there, and I prefer to live under the French in France, where the government is more liberal." He went on to say that the French hate colored people, yet pretend they are liberal, and that he disliked them because they are the most nationalistic people in the world. Nevertheless, he went back to Morocco and stayed for much longer. So, still there is this question, which Gary Holcomb, another interesting scholar of McKay's work, rightly maintains we must ask, and this is his question. As a traveler of the African diaspora and the foremost black nationalist poet, why didn't McKay go farther south to Ghana or Nigeria or the Congo, to the quote-unquote real Africa? Such a question, Holcomb argues, necessarily ignores the fact that McKay experienced his most mature prose writing period while living in Morocco, completing Banjo, Romance in Marseille, the short story collection Gingertown, and his last published novel, Banana Bottom, which generally people consider to be his masterpiece. Such texts are remarkable for synthesizing critiques of domestic American racism, European colonialism in Africa, and sexual hegemony. One wonders what kind of criticism would exist on McKay if he had even taken a holiday in Black Africa. So Holcomb goes on to say, scholars apparently assume that McKay simply was in the wrong part of Africa and never made it to the right part. Well, I'm not one of those scholars. As already noted, the term nationalist to describe McKay is inaccurate. He was militant in response to injustice, but he never was a separatist. His most famous poem, If We Must Die, written in 1919 in response to a series of riots directed against African Americans, does not even mention race. The question that Holcomb poses is one that naturally will come to mind. In fact, it's precisely the question that instigated this particular essay. But surely it does not necessarily ignore what McKay achieved in Morocco. McKay was comfortable there, he was inspired, but this doesn't mean that if he had actually undertaken a sub-Saharan sojourn, he wouldn't have borne creative fruit. On the other hand, we have no way of knowing what might have happened to McKay if he had undertaken such a journey. There are people who argue that McKay was in the wrong part of Africa. St. Clair Drake implies this. But it's a judgment McKay himself would not have accepted. Now, admittedly, it would be intriguing to know how McKay's responses to Black Africa, had he ever gone there, might have compared or contrasted with the responses of Langston Hughes in his autobiography, The Big Sea, for instance, or Richard Wright in Black Power from 1954, though their reactions have not been well received by those who ideologize race. I mean, one of the things that both of them concluded was they weren't African. But if you consider the hundreds of years of history that intervene, it's quite a surprise. I mean, I actually had a Nigerian former colleague who, in a discussion with me one day, said, well, there's no difference, the only difference between me and my African American students is my passport. And I said, well, excuse me, history intervened. I mean, there's a lot of differences. And indeed, the relations between Africans and African Americans on my campus are, I won't say non-existent, but when there are collisions, they're usually, that's what they are. I mean, there's usually some negative energy generated. I have a good friend who's the chair of the Africana Studies Department at Ohio State University, which is one of the biggest and one of the best. And he sort of described the way things are in his department as tribal warfare. African Americans, Africans, and then some others. I don't think it needs to be like that, but that's another indication of the fact that race is not a simple thing, and race doesn't cut it in every instance. There are other things that create differences between people, even if they all are the same color. So McKay decided to stay in Tangier, a city where it's possible to see the Atlantic and the Mediterranean at the same time. More than any other colonial city, Tangier possessed an interesting layering of indigenous and expatriate cultures. Another scholar, taking a different angle, argues that McKay picked Tangier because it was a safe, queer port. But there is no evidence that McKay's sexuality was unduly constrained wherever he happened to find himself, because if Tangier was loose, so too was Marseille. And if you're familiar with Banjo, you know he spent a lot of time there and described the openness of that particular locale. McKay also went to Marrakesh, and he said he wanted to see it because it was a city where the caravanserai would go, right? People would go from Marrakesh down into the interior of Africa and they would come back. And he also said, I wanted to see that monumental city which was founded by a Senegalese conqueror. He described Marrakesh as you'll probably find this interesting. He said it was like a big West African picnic. Right? Here's a guy in North Africa from the Caribbean and just seeing connections, seeing linkages. So why didn't he go to Senegal or follow that caravan route back into Africa? Well, In an essay from 1932 entitled A Negro Writer to His Critics, McKay seemed to provide at least a partial answer to this question. He wrote that one critic of his work had suggested that I might make a trip to Africa and there write about Negro life in its pure state. But I don't believe that any such place exists anywhere upon the earth today, since modern civilization has touched and stirred the remotest corners. Same argument that was being made in that essay from 1904 from National Geographic magazine. We're now a global society. He then added, I can see no reason why an African-American intellectual should go to any part of Africa to undertake an experiment in living unless he felt irresistibly forced to do so. The African-American may gain spiritual benefits by returning in spirit to this African origin, but as an artist he will remain a unique product of Western civilization. You know that business about you might gain spiritual benefit by going back in spirit seems to be one of the major arguments of Derek Walcott's Play Dream on Monkey Mountain. That maybe, and I know that during the 7 years that I spent in Africa, I witnessed some serious disappointments in the case of individuals who came physically to Africa looking for something that they were just not able to find. So when Jake in Home to Harlem, when Ray in Home to Harlem admonishes Jake, this is a new age with new methods of living, he is actually speaking for McKay, who, although he felt a certain contempt for that grand business called civilization, quote unquote, nevertheless relished the freedom of movement that modernity afforded. Indeed, W.E.B. Du Bois's notion of modernity as the exemplary period of contact of diverse races of men is a key to Claude McKay's itinerancy. As McKay wrote in Banjo, quote, it was as if every country of the world where Negroes had lived had sent representatives into Marseille, unquote. The Africans he meets in Europe apparently are more attracted to roots, R-O-U-T-E-S, than roots, R-O-O-T-S, and they don't appear compelled to travel those routes back to their points of origin. Why then should Claude McKay travel a route to sub-Saharan Africa that for him is not immediate but ancestral, on a return journey that is only in a psychological or imagined sense an actual return? Can one go back to where one has never been? McKay's Africa is an Africa dispersed, not confined to its physical geography. Probably it is unwise to speak of a pure African reality. Think of those caravan routes and the various types of intercourse that they facilitated. But certainly it would have been possible for McKay, had he journeyed into the interior of any of those colonized territories, to encounter traditional African culture in a highly unadulterated state. I've collected some books by travelers to Africa that were written primarily in the 1930s and then later, and they are to varying degrees sensationalizing and racist. People going looking for cannibals, for instance. But they document, especially in their photographs, an Africa still relatively untouched by colonialism. One can refer to early works of African fiction like Cyprian Akwenzi's People of the City, 1954, that highlight the disparities between traditional African life and the modern ethos of the urban centers on the eve of the unfolding of African independence, several decades after McKay ceased his wanderings. In the end, all that we can say for certainty, I think, on the question of why McKay didn't venture into sub-Saharan Africa was that he just wasn't driven to do so. And, note the question that I asked before I started. Why should he have felt he had to do so? I think that's a question that you might want to contemplate. Part of the explanation is to be found in the state of the world in that period between two world wars. Part of it, too, may be attributed to what we might call black cosmopolitanism. On the one hand, there is the cosmopolitan of Alain Locke, the first African-American Rhodes Scholar, from McKay's own time, author of The New Negro, a major figure in the Harlem Renaissance. Or to take a contemporary figure, Anglo-Ghanaian academic Kwame Anthony Appiah, author of Cosmopolitanism, Ethics in a World of Strangers from 2005. We call that the talented 10th strain of cosmopolitanism. On the other hand, there's the cosmopolitan of McKay's Marseille Motley. Call it the global proletarian strain, although Brent Hayes Edwards, in the practice of diaspora, calls it vagabond internationalism, which I like better. What is important and intriguing about McKay is that he mediates between the two extremes. He's intellectually and creatively on a par with the former by background, temperament, and frequently circumstance aligned with the latter. From an Afrocentric point of view, Cosmopolitan is apostasy. Viewed diaspora-centrically, and I am, I think, strongly diaspora-centrist in my thinking. Cosmopolitan is an appropriate perspective with regard to the wider regions, the cosmic space traversed by the Black experience. Not a transcendent space, necessarily, but certainly a more encompassing one. Gary Holcomb puts it aptly in a few resonant phrases. Diaspora, for McKay, quote, is the phenomenological interzone, the existential international quarter, the epistemological commonwealth. Well, it's quite a mouthful. But if you unpack it, I think he's really very close to focusing in absolutely on McKay. Now, I spent a few pages talking about Afropolitanism, which I think I'm going to skip, and just go to my last paragraph. It was modernity with its potential for beneficial as well as unsettling human transformations which interested McKay, rather than modernism, a style. Perhaps one of the reasons he did not feel compelled to visit Black Africa was that to the extent that part of the world had been impacted by modernity, it was a disruptive encounter, rough, often oppressive. In short, the impact of colonialism. But without the progressive development McKay hoped for, the sort he was looking forward to in the wake of the Russian Revolution. On the other hand, colonialism and the advent of modernity in Africa enabled Africans to come out of Africa and wander the globe as largely free agents. And so McKay did not need to go to Africa because it was possible in his own time for Africa to come to him so that he and Africa could meet on the common ground of diaspora. And I think I'll stop there in the interest of time for questions and commentary. Thank you.
Yeah, it's open for questions, comments, and anything. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
You go ahead.
Okay, you were first then. Go
Did
ahead.
McKay had children? I know he was homosexual. He
Well,
had
it's probably, I think it might be better to just describe him as queer, because, you know, he was bisexual. I mean, so there's,
Oh, okay.
that's a more encompassing term. He did have a daughter, one daughter, from a short-lived marriage that he had early on in his life. So I don't know if that's precluded your question now.
No. I wanted to know because I think you said something that he didn't return to a place. I think.
He didn't go back to Jamaica ever, really, except in the last book he wrote, which he never finished, was all about Jamaica.
Okay.
And his last novel, Banana Bottom, which is considered to be his best and most important book, takes place in Jamaica. So, you know, he left physically. It's sort of like James Joyce, right? Never left Dublin, you know, even though he lived in both. So.
Great.
Yeah, I'm curious about, so his time in Paris, and you know, in Paris, we talk about this in our course, you know, this very clear sort of classes of Black people, right? The African Americans are sort of more privileged, and then you have Caribbean, and then Senegalese or Sub-Saharan Africa, and then
North Africa.
North Africa would be at the bottom. I'm just curious how, you know, because you're talking about this guy he meets, telling him to go to Casablanca, right, to travel there. Do you have any sense of how this might have affected, I mean, it's for Claude McKay, but I'm always curious of this too for others that were there in this kind of international scene, how this affected their desire to go and travel, because some of them sort of, you know, they get to Europe with this idea of going to Africa and then almost don't really want to go to Africa that badly anymore.
It's a complicated question because the kinds of people we're dealing with are so diverse in their thinking, right? And again, you can't, it's partly a class issue, it's partly, you know, to some extent it has to do with a certain ideological orientation or not having that ideological orientation. McKay preferred Marseille to Paris, I think. You know, I mean, Banjo testifies to that. Partly because the kinds of people who were going and wanting to really be in Paris were people like Connie Palmer, right, who was a Francophile, right, extreme. I had a long footnote here about about Cullen, because Cullen's really interesting in a lot of ways too, but he's different from McKay in many respects. Remember, he had an MA from Harvard, and so he
The
definitely.
main thing is he could speak French.
Yeah, and
And
he
McKay
definitely,
could-
yeah, he was a new Negro to the max. One of the things you have to understand, and it's one of the reasons why I began with all of those contrasts about McKay, right? McKay is situated by many people in the Harlem Renaissance. He didn't situate himself there. He didn't want to be associated with it. He said, I was there, you know, I was around before the Harlem Renaissance, I was around after the Harlem Renaissance. He influenced it, however. He influenced, you know, negritude. He wasn't necessarily a negritudinous, but there were people who were really interested in the way he wrote about the black experience. One thing I want to say about, here's a difference between somebody like Cullen, for instance, and even McKay to an extent, and a lot of the people that he met that came out of Africa. They were stateless persons. There were no countries there really, right? I mean, later on, those people, the territories that they came from are now colonies of France, England, places like that. But they were people without passports. They were just wandering the world free in many senses, but also, you know, free from protection in a way. They didn't have a U.S. passport, they didn't have a British passport, anything like that. And so, and what's interesting is, you know, those people didn't want to go back to Africa. They wanted to be out of Africa because they realized there was another world out there, right? And that question about the importance of going back to Africa, I really think is a much newer one, right? Henry Louis Gates Jr., I don't know if you're all familiar with him, but he's like a very, very prominent African American. And he made an interesting comment in one of his books. He said, of the big three writers in African American Canada at a certain point, James Baldwin, Richard Wright, and Ralph Ellison, it's only Richard Wright that went to Africa, and you know, he was very interested in the freedom movement because he was in, you know, the Gold Coast, which became Ghana, and so he saw what was happening there and he supported it, but he also recognized the extent to which he could not conceive of himself as an African, per se. So sometimes there's an intellectual orientation. What's really fascinating about McKay is he could go to Paris and hang out with the intelligentsia. He preferred to be with that motley crew in Marseille, people who didn't necessarily have intellectual pretensions. I mean, if you think, you know, if you're familiar with Cullen's poem Heritage, and it's interesting, from that period there's a lot of black poems with the title Heritage. His is the longest and the most complicated. It's really braided together in complex fashion. I've studied that poem and I've taught that poem and I still haven't worked it all out yet because I don't think McKay was able to work everything out. There's conflict in that poem, there's tension in that poem, and there's a lot of stress. And here's a man who was like really, you know, the new Negro, the guy who dressed up elegantly, spoke French beautifully, that sort of thing. But then you start to configure in the whole business of being a black person in America 100 years ago, 80 years ago. You remember this comment that Du Bois makes, right, in the Souls of Black book. He said, you know, he talks about double consciousness and said we're really aware of our two-ness, right? We're Americans, but we're also black, and we like. I happen to think that double consciousness is really a phenomenon of the talented 10th. I mean, I don't think that those people that McKay met that came out of Africa to places like Marseille and so forth had any double consciousness. Even though they experienced colonialism, racism, and everything else. It's people who, you know, have an education, who've been moving around a lot in circles where there are a lot of white people rather than remaining in black communities, that then also note how, no matter how high achievers they are, there's always some question about them simply because of their color. Are they going to be marked out differently? That's another issue that probably require another lecture. But it's still this idea that you're in a society which marks you out as different, and that makes it hard for you to be who you are in some respects. Especially if that difference is, as it almost always is in circumstances like this, an invidious one. It's not a question of like, you're different and I'm different and isn't that great? And we can share that difference. It's like, you're different from me, so therefore you're lesser than me in some respects. And that's a human problem, that we still need to work on. I mean, you can even find this within communities of color. There'll be people who are ethnocentric, but say in Africa you'll have people who are Igbos on the one hand or Yorubas on the other, that most of us look at them and couldn't distinguish one from the other, just see a black face. They make very sharp distinctions between and they're often not flattering. So, I don't know if you wanted to follow up.
I'm interested in this. You're talking about how this kind of conflicted, even his response to Paris. As you say, he can hang out, he can be with the intelligentsia, but then he's critical of this. But even in this question, why didn't he go there? You could read into this also this sense of, well, that's where you really belong. You know, I mean, this was turned around from white America's perspective to say, well, you should all really would be better off going back to Africa, right? And
Oh, there's
when
that,
you have
yeah.
rights, when you have rights, when you're talking about rights response, and even his, his sense. I mean, I find Claude McKay interesting because he's always sort of, as you say, in this kind of conflicted space, right?
Yeah, whatever you can say about him, you can almost say the opposite too. I mean, that's what makes him, for me, really fascinating. Look, I'm kind of sorry he didn't go to sub-Saharan Africa, because I think he could have written a really interesting book, whether it was fiction or nonfiction, whatever, right? Not because he was finding his roots or anything like that. He might have even gone and had the same experience and said, I know I'm not African, I'm a person of African descent, which is something quite different, but he didn't. Remember what he said in that essay? He said, like, unless you have a particular reason for going there, well, what's the reason? Ever since Alex Haley, there's this roots phenomenon, right? So he knew where his roots were. He didn't need to go there. He had other issues, like he did not want to go to places that were colonized by European powers. He was really interested in African liberation, which he never got to see, right? But he didn't want to go and pretend to be an African. You follow what I'm saying? I mean, my wife, who's a Nigerian, met all kinds of people, who came to Africa. Some of them were black, some of them were white, came for different reasons, looking for different things. And a lot of times, if you come with preconceived notions, you're going to have a difficult time. Because I know at least one instance of a young man who came, he was college age, his wife had came on an exchange program to my university, and he was quite militant. This was a number of years ago. But he had this notion that he was African, right? And the Africans, dissuaded him from that notion pretty quickly. I mean, he'd go into a market, and people would call him the same thing they'd call me, the word that they use for white person. Now, clearly he and I were very distinguishable, but they recognized he was a foreigner. He was black, but he wasn't one of them. And that's not what he was hoping for, that's not what he was expecting, and it put him through a lot of changes. So, it's very difficult to generalize about these things, which is one of the reasons I'm having trouble, giving you what may be a satisfying answer. But I think you have to think about why did Cullen go to Paris and why did McKay go? And they didn't go for the same reasons. And I don't think Connie Cullen would have found himself very comfortable in Marseille. But McKay could be comfortable in Paris too if he wanted to be. Depends on who he was hanging out with. And that's one of the reasons why I think that one scholar's comment that McKay was capable of being at home everywhere is interesting. That makes him a cosmopolitan figure rather than a rooted character in some ways, right? I mean, and it raises all kinds of questions about quote unquote authenticity, identity, and everything else. I mean, who are you and why are you, and so forth. And McKay thought a lot about the experience of black people in the world, a world of racism. And I don't think he worried too much about who he was. I think he had a pretty good idea of who he was. He was a guy who wanted to do his own thing. He didn't want to be constrained by geography or anything else. He wrote a lot of interesting stuff. But I find him almost more interesting as a human being than a novelist, although he brings up so many interesting issues in his fiction, all kinds of questions that we could be asking, and contradictory issues, loving America and at the same time hating, a civilization that imposes itself on people invidiously and things of that sort. Again, there's that conflict, right? And it depends on what he's experiencing. And that's why I said that even though modernity, people have said, brought a lot of negative baggage along with it, it did enable people to move. And that's a certain kind of freedom too. And they could move from one place where they may have never been able to leave their village out into the world, and encounter all kinds of other people from the world and have all kinds of, and McKay really relished that. I think he wanted to be part of it. You know, he was a lot of the people he was hanging around with weren't necessarily even literate. But he lived among them, and then he wrote about them, right? But not, you know, in some kind of condescending way. He was able to actually be on their level in a lot of interesting ways and become a kind of spokesperson for their experience, which somebody like Connie Cullen never could have done. Although I like Cullen's poetry, I don't. But I mean, he's a very different kind of character and a kind of more inclined. I think I'd rather have spent time hanging out with Claude McKay than Connie Cullen. And yes,
Christopher.
Yeah, I apologize for coming late. This is so interesting. Just want to ask a question which you may have already covered, so I apologize.
no problem.
In terms of mixing with the more, with the sort of artistic world, particularly the Josephine Baker theatrical world, not only in France but in other places, obviously Langston Hughes crossed over. Was he actively supportive or dismissive, or was he part of that world at all, or was he very, very separated?
You know, I don't know a lot about that. I do know that in his autobiography he talks a lot about some of the black musicals, one of which Josephine Baker was in before she went, you know, to France. And I think he would have really liked, and can't recall him saying anything about it, but I think he would have admired somebody like that. He would have liked that idea that she could even go to, you know, France and become a figure there. Not so sure. He liked these black musicals because they portrayed black people on their own terms, right? They would write the music, they would do, I mean, there were things that were sort of produced and done by white people, but then there were other things that were done all by black people. And those are the ones that he really liked a lot. And I also know that he had an encounter with George Bernard Shaw at one point, because he could hang out with people like that and talk, and Shaw said to him, "It must be a terrible burden to be a black poet. Why didn't you become a boxer?" I mean, and so it's like, you know, I don't know what McKay's reply to that was, but I'm pretty sure he might have said, you know, that's not the easiest thing in the world either, right? And there's certain expectations placed on you. But I have a mind here. I'm a creative. Why should I become a boxer and use my fists when I can use my words as weapons, right? I mean, and so, you know, Shaw, I don't think he was putting McKay down necessarily. He was trying to sort of say, I kind of, you know, sympathize with your plight. But I mean, you know, this whole idea of, Gates has made a kind of an interesting comment about this kind of thing too. He said, you know, there's all these young black men out there who want to become basketball stars. You know, NBA hero, you know, making $40 million. He said, you've got a better chance of becoming a black lawyer or a black doctor than becoming an NBA star. But people aren't thinking about that. Partly because, you know, and this was definitely true at the time that he encountered Shaw. What were the avenues for achievement that African Americans and people of color could indulge in? Sports and entertainment. And I guess, you know, poetry is not entertainment. So, you know, I mean, especially if you're writing stuff that intellectuals are reading and critiquing and so forth, you're not on that same level. And so, yeah, Ishmael Reed, an African American writer that I know and I'm very interested in, you know, he's talked about his life. He's had 40 years of boxing on paper. That's what it is. Writing is fighting is the title. It's a collection of essays. Anyone else? Step up. There's no prize, but there's...
Well, we have some time.
Yeah. Ask a good question and Professor Sandra will give you extra credit. Any comments?
Or Ibsen, who is writing a thesis on the poets.
Yeah, on the spot.
Well, you have a comment? I'd be happy to.
How did he get along? I mean, you mentioned he wasn't particularly hot on the talented tents coming to Paris and Du Bois.
Oh, I don't think. I think he would have said, "Yeah, do whatever, go wherever." But I don't think he wanted to spend his whole life among intellectuals, and I sympathize with that point of view. You know, having done that. I mean, although, you know, a lot of people I met in Africa were a different kind of intellectual, and there were people that weren't intellectuals at all, and still spoke more languages than I did. So,
But
I-
some of these guys actually, like Du Bois, they really didn't like what he was doing, right? I mean, the comments that on
Home to
Harlem,
Harlem, yeah. Well, Du Bois is, I think, something of a Victorian figure. Interestingly enough, though, that book that I cited by Josh Gosiak actually looks at McKay as a late Victorian figure, interesting in some ways. But I think he was wrong on the business of, the McKay didn't really have much of an orientation to Africa. He didn't have the same kind of orientation that people had to Africa in the 60s, for instance, right? But then you have to understand, too, you read a poem like Heritage by Connie Cullen, it's pretty clear that Connie Cullen doesn't know squat about Africa. I mean, it's exoticized in his work as much as it is in many cases in the work of white people, except that he says, I can feel Africa, in my veins. But a lot of the people in the 60s who were touting Africa didn't know either. I want to give you an interesting example. When I was getting my PhD at the State University of New York at Buffalo, there was a Nigerian scholar and writer who had just gotten his PhD, and he was on my dissertation committee. His name is Isidore Pepper, and he's a very well-known scholar and novelist. He came to me one day and he said, Bob, these hairstyles that these African Americans are wearing, they call it afros. Why? I said, well, isn't it African? He said, no way. He said, we style our hair. Now, what he didn't understand was that was a style, right? But what he meant was, it's braided, and when I first got to Nigeria, I saw some of these things that were like these elaborate structures, women would wire their hair up and do all kinds of stuff. And he said, no, well, only crazy people run around looking like that. So I said, okay, and so just to sort of footnote this even more, because I've been trying to write about this a little bit. In one of his autobiographical pieces, Henry Louis Gates Jr. talks about how he goes to Cambridge University, and at Cambridge University he meets Wole Soyinka, the Nigerian Nobel laureate, the first African writer to get a Nobel Prize in 1986, I believe it was. And Soyinka is his supervisor, and he's been reading up on African stuff and studying something called Nomo, and Soyinka says, first thing he says to him is, I only took you as a student because you don't go around spouting that Nomo nonsense. Now, actually, I think there's a problem there from Soyinka's point of view too, but I'm writing about that. But here's the other thing Gates said. Soyinka looked balefully at my afro. And he doesn't say anything further. I'm writing about that because there's a reason why he looked balefully at his afro. That's not African. He did, for him that was an alien thing, right? Why are you, there's another essay I read, and I can't remember the guy's name now. He's from Mali. And he talked about how young Africans were dressing up like, black Americans who were wearing afros, but they were also dressing up like, teenagers, hippies, right? They all got incarcerated, they had their heads shaved, and they were forced to wear traditional dress because that was considered to be an abomination. And so, on the one hand, there's this, we can open ourselves up to the world again, right? Why can't we do things that Americans do? But there's these misunderstandings on both sides in many cases about what does that actually signify? What does that actually mean? And so there were people in the 60s who were, taking African names, who didn't know about Africa from direct experience, and when they had it, it was mind-blowing in many respects because it turned out to be a lot different. Gates did this whole series of programs, The Wonders of the African World, and it incited a tremendous controversy because he would go there and he'd meet people and he'd say, there was, professor, right, famous guy, teaches at Harvard, and he'd say, yeah, I'm a descendant of slaves, and you people sold my ancestors. Whoa, that didn't go down Africans, berated him for that and said, Africans had nothing to do with the slave trade. Well, that's not true. So, so there are these issues that have to do with the diaspora, and so when I was in Nigeria long enough to get they forgot that I was white, I guess. So I would hear these family quarrels, right? When they were all together, West Indians, African Americans and Africans, it's blacks against whites, right? But then when that was out of the picture, there weren't any white people around because I dissolved into the background. Right? They would go at each other. The people from the diaspora quarreling with the people from Africa because of slavery, right? And saying, you people. I had a student who told me her family made their money in the slave trade when I was in Nigeria. She didn't feel the need to feel bad about it, I guess. So history's like really complicated and twisted. And then you may or may not know, this came up in his class yesterday too, that people from the Caribbean, black people from the Caribbean, have conflicts with African Americans a lot, partly because they're very upwardly mobile and ambitious, and so they bump up against African Americans sometimes too. And then there's the African American thing, which is another issue too, and it has more to do with culture than race and history.
Gates has a whole program where he was tracing the DNA of different people in the United States, particularly African Americans,
Yes.
and being able to show them exactly what their ancestral past was.
He discovered he was 49% white
Right.
when he did his own.
And they found some very far-reaching, influences like Japanese and things that, most blacks would never have suspected. But the main point that his program made was that no African American can claim true African ancestry, in other words, unadulterated pure line back to Africa, because of the history of slavery and the systematic raping and impregnating of Africans by their masters and overseers. So when people start to think that the two cultures are the same, how can they ignore those hundreds of years of oppression and of miscegenation as well? I'm a linguist, and we constantly talk about how
Same thing happens with language, right?
Yes, exactly. You cannot talk about a pure, entity because of the history that has preceded it. Our languages are all mixed and our cultures are all mixed. And it is kind of crazy that people, think that they can harken back to a period 400 or 500 years previous and claim, direct link. So, yeah.
I remember a quote I used in an article on the Englishman's purity, the purity of the Englishman, coming from the Normans and the Germans and the Britons and the Angles and the Jutes.
Yeah, they weren't pure either.
Who's got my photograph? Because I need to have it back. Oh, okay. I can
He's in
trust you.
safe hands.
No, she has a good one.
It's safe.
This, I kind of probably shouldn't have done this, because for some people it's a sensitive issue, but this whole business of like people who are like going to Africa to look for their roots, some people just made them up. My friend, for instance, who is the head of Africana Studies at Ohio State, he had a name, and his history is really interesting, and I'm going to try to rehearse it for you, but his background is really interesting. But then at one point he decided to become a member of the Nation of Islam, and so he became X, or took an X. When he got to Nigeria, even though we were living on the same campus among the Yorubas, he kind of became an Igbo, which was interesting, and he has this Igbo. There's a reason why he has the Igbo name too, and that's another really interesting story. It wasn't so he just sort of flipped a coin or something like that. He had a relationship with an Igbo guy in the United States who gave him that name. He didn't just take it himself. And one of the things that's interesting about it, and it's kind of poignant, people will take these African names, but they're hybrids. They're, one term comes from Swahili, one term comes from, and they make no sense.
Right.
It just sounds African. And so I used to tell people I was in Africa looking for my roots too, because that's where all life began.
Mm-hmm.
The mitochondrial Eve, right? It's just a couple 100,000 years ago in Africa, the woman from whom everybody alive today is descended from. And then, of course, in America, because we have to do this kind of nonsense, on the cover of Time magazine, they have a picture of the black Adam and Eve, with Jerry curls and things like that. It's just nonsense. So, history is weird, but very interesting. But we can't do without it, because we won't understand who we are if we don't know what came before us, right? And the genealogical thing is really interesting too. There's a novel it's called Tent of Miracles. It's written by a really great Brazilian writer named Jorge Amado. And it's about this business of, Brazil touting itself as a racial democracy when it's actually something else. And so there are people going around boasting about their pure whiteness and things. And there's a genealogist who's at the center of the book who discovers that some of these people are boasting about their white heritage, and they have slave great-grandmothers and things like that. And then basically the point is that there's no such thing as a pure human being of any kind, and especially in a place like Brazil. I had a good friend who showed me a picture of his family, and it ranged from you know, as black as you could be to somebody who looked like me. He said, typical extended Brazilian family, a rainbow.
Same thing
So,
here in Puerto
you know,
Rico.
Yeah, same here.
Same where? Same
Here
here.
in Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico, yeah. Well, I can look at this class and I can see somebody down already, yeah.
And it's worth noting that here, the mother country is still Spain, it's not Africa.
Oh, that's interesting.
But, I mean, this sometimes there's sort of, you know, there's always discussions about this, you know, I mean, for obvious reasons, they're trying to, you know, because of the treatment of people who are darker skinned or connected to slavery, but you talk about made up ancestries, here it's made up,
Yeah.
I'm pure Spanish, there's a lot of pure Spanish people.
Or pure Taínos.
Yeah, it's
Oh, yes, that's-
Now there's discovered more than Taino, yeah.
Well, but you know, if you know the history of a lot of this racist stuff, right? In America, you know, we have like blacks and mulattoes and maybe quadroons and stuff, but didn't the French have like, you know, down to 128 or something like that? Every kind of, you know, parsing from 100% white down to like 99% white and 1% black, and they had a name for everything. I mean, if that, given the fact that that's an aspect of our history, people did think that, so where's the 100% of anything? Right? You understand what I'm saying? They have a certain presumption that there's a 100% white person maybe, and maybe lost over in the woods somewhere there's 100%. Most people are something in between, as a result of history. I mean, that's why I had that pun on intercourse, you know, in my paper. You know. People didn't just walk around the world; they did other things. You know, when they encountered people, and so, and that's another reason why this discussion. I talked about this a little bit in his class yesterday. This whole discussion of race is in a way ridiculous, because there are more statistically, apparently, there are more differences between people within a so-called race than there are between people in so-called races, and yet, people have had the controversy in the United States too, and say, well, race biologically doesn't exist; it's a social construct. But racism is very real. It's very real, and so how do you account for that? Well, I think it's a form of pathology myself, but I don't know what they don't have an inoculation for it. So.
I think it's not that long ago that when you looked at the Norton Anthology of American Literature, there were very, very few black writers.
Yeah, or a few
And
women.
now it's almost the opposite happening. That the anthology claims writers like Jamaica Kingpin, right, who is Antiguan as an
She's in the Northern
writer.
Anthology?
Even Walcott is claimed.
Well,
It
he
seems to
lived
be
in the US.
anybody who is anybody, even if they just spend 1 hour in the US, they suddenly become American. With Claude McKay, he was one of the very first one who said that. He was claimed right away. But it's really a serious question. It's not just a joke. Is this guy an African American writer or is he a Caribbean writer? And how would you make the case for either one? Can you actually be both?
Yeah, I think, look, I don't know how, well, maybe I shouldn't say this, but Professor Sanders said when I sent my title to him, I should add the word Caribbean before, Claude McKay, so the people, and I thought, well, if this was Jamaica, I wouldn't have to do that. Because in Jamaica, he's a Jamaican writer. Right?
Yeah.
He published 2 volumes of poetry in Jamaican vernacular, right? Now, there's this interesting question some people have asked us, well, why didn't Claude McKay write in the vernacular when he got to the U.S.? Any ideas? There's a couple fairly simple answers.
The audience.
No one would understand.
No, it's, first of all, it wasn't his own dialect, right? It's different. It's not the same. Black English vernacular is tricky in some ways too, but it's like even the dialect verse that people wrote in the 19th century is probably not the way that the slaves actually talked. It's a little bit stylized. The other thing was that he wanted his work to be widely read and disseminated, and he knew that if he wrote in standard English, which he was perfectly capable of doing, more people would read him. And and I think it's really instructive that sonnet, "If We Must Die," which is about racial attacks on black people, doesn't mention race at all, and so other people picked it up as a battle cry against injustice, period. It makes the poem, now it's no longer a poem addressed only to black people or white races, a poem addressed to anybody in the world who's oppressing other people.
And I mean, there's this famous case that Churchill in the middle of World War II read that out in Parliament.
That's now,
Right? So in
Yeah.
English, I mean, a former, he was very much involved in British colonialism in Africa. That, you know, Churchill lived forever, but he has a very, very bad, you know, sinister past.
there's now some question
And
as
he
to whether
wrote
he
this
actually
out.
said that.
Well,
though, you know,
that's
but
the
anyway,
story.
it's yeah, and I've told the story too, but then I've read that that probably is an apocryphal tale. But it would work, right? I mean, he could very easily have done that because it was, the British could have stood behind that poem just as easily as anybody else. We're fighting our enemies. Yes.
Why did McKay become a U.S. citizen?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, he loved America, although he had a lot of problems with racism here and everything else.
Yeah, that's what I'm
But you know, McKay changed in many ways, right? I think why he became an American citizen has something to do with the question of why he never went back to Jamaica. But he also was a guy who was a communist and an atheist, became conservative and
Yeah, but
died a
at a
Catholic.
really bad time in the United States to declare himself, because, I mean, he dies in 48. In 50, you've got the McCarthy Committee going full swing. If he had lived a couple of years longer, he would probably have been called before the HUAC.
Well, he'd already recanted all that stuff because, you know, he got barred from the U.S. for a while because he was a communist, but people actually were able to intercede for him in the 1930s, which was a contentious period too, and
Right.
allow him back in.
It
And
just
there's a
seems
question of
strange.
like whether he was card carrying or not, but I mean, that word internationalist, right? But see, that's why I think maybe transnationalist is even better. This guy could cross borders all the time and be fine, you know. I mean, there's stories about him living in Morocco and, you know, wearing Arab dress and smoking a hookah. You know what I mean? It's like, you know, so he's crossing cultures too. As a North African, I've had this debate with people. I have a good friend, an African writer, Nuruddin Farah, has actually been nominated a couple of times for the Nobel Prize. And I tend to consider Africa to be sub-Saharan Africa. He said, no, it's, you know, but then you look at, see where he is from on the map and you'll see why he has that attitude. You know, Somalia is not. So, but there is a dramatic difference once you cross that line up there. I mean, if you think about the, you know, the racial conflict, among other things, that you have in the Sudan, right? The people that are more Arab against the people that are more African, people who are animists and people who are traditionalists in other ways are discriminated against. So there's a lot of conflict there, even in a country that is, you know, what, geographically the largest country in Africa. You've got a north-south split like you do in a lot of places. So it's like I tell my students in all my classes, complexity, you know, don't run away from it because it'll come and bite you, right? But a lot of people don't want to deal with things that are complex. Everybody's looking seemingly for, not everybody, a lot of people are looking for simple answers, simple, clear-cut responses. I mean, I've had various responses to my essay. Some people have thought, oh, this is great, and other people said, wait, you didn't answer your own question. I said, well, what I'm doing is assessing something. I'm trying to weigh the different sides of it, and there is no, I mean, you can't have a thesis about this in a way without somebody coming along and saying, well, there's 3 things that are going to knock your thesis right out of the water here. The best you can do is try to make some guesses based on what McKay said, what happened to him in history, and many other things. And I really think it has to do with modernity opening up the world to the free flow of human beings, and he was celebrating that in the sense and saying, you know, Africa's coming to me, I don't have to go to Africa. We're all meeting here on the same ground. And it's not native grounds anymore, it's something else. Because native grounds would mean, you know, there are expressions that they have in places like Nigeria, to be a son or daughter of the soil, meaning you're tied to the place where you were born. A lot of people didn't feel that that was necessary. They said, why can't I go and be part of something else? And maybe I'm not abandoning my own thing, but why can't I extend it in certain ways? And McKay's a perfect example of that.
I don't know whether you can answer that or whether there's enough research on that yet. I only know that she's a Jamaican scholar who actually wrote something now about Claude McKay in Morocco.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't recall exactly now the details. Too long, I mean, it's not that long ago, but I can't. Was he, or did he make any effort to get familiar with North African, especially Moroccan literature which is very rich.
Oh, the literature, gee, I don't know.
Did he know anything about that at all?
I really don't
Was
know.
it just like the place, the people?
He made I quoted, he made a comment about the mosaics, right?
Yeah.
Right? But, if you think about what a mosaic represents, right, and I think, he saw the whole culture as kind of a mosaic, right? That's why.
And I think he quotes some Islamic kind of thing in translation at the very end of his.
I really don't know about his orientation to Moroccan literature. He met a lot of different kinds of people. I don't know how many of them were writers. Right? So that's an interesting question. Maybe
Because I think she writes about it. Can you remember her name?
No, I can't. But I
Wait,
wanted.
she was here actually, Bishop.
Bishop,
Jacqueline
Bishop.
Bishop.
Yeah, but there's more work to be done on McKay in Morocco, and this woman's trying to do it. But from what I could find on the internet, she hasn't completed it. She's given speeches in places. She's working on a book, I guess, which will be interesting. I mean, there's so much more to be discovered. A lot of these people, have been around for a long time. They've been read and reread. People are writing about them. But then there are all of these new perspectives that are opening up. And I didn't know, for instance, a lot about the politics of this. In fact, that he was actually, it wasn't his own decision to not go to certain places. He wasn't even allowed to go to certain places. And
Because I mean, it would have been almost natural if you're a writer and you go to a place like that you would sort of be interested in trying to find out what do these people write, and all
well,
that.
especially
So-
if you're writing. I mean, he wrote several books while he was there. And so you would think that he might, because other writers from other parts of the world have gone and expatriated themselves to places like Morocco, like Knowles and people like that. William Burroughs and some of the Beats went there. And things like that. And they immediately started looking for other artists and other writers. So I don't know whether McKay didn't have time for that or what. I just don't recall him talking about it at all.
Mhm.
Anything
No, no,
I
no.
read. And so there's a research project or something. But there's probably
Because
not
it
one-
wasn't just a place where he went to, but it was also attractive to French writers and European writers, and for all sorts of reasons, not just creativity, but for other reasons.
Yeah, well, I
Certain
didn't
things are
want to
very-
make a facetious
certain
comment.
things are
was
very
a joke,
cheap
but
there,
that is
right?
the truth.
Certain things are very cheap.
Was
Other
there-
things as well,
Yeah, well,
He was only interested in wine, as far as I could tell. Okay, maybe I'm wrong about that.
yeah, I think that may not be true.
For many people, they was
Probably not.
Paris
Probably
first and
not.
then 10 years next,
Yeah.
right?
I mean, somehow I can't picture him hanging out in a cafe in Paris and drinking absinthe or something like that.
He's a strange character though. Like sometimes you get this feeling like I'm never surprised by certain parts of his work. He ends up this very strict Catholic thing. You can see this strain in his work, but then there's this whole other strain where he's like, when he's writing in Banjo about what's going on in Marseille. It's like this whole other thing. So I mean, again, maybe this is these conflicts that you're.
Well, think it.
You're talking about. Even with modernity, he seems to have this conflicted relationship.
To some extent, because he sees, America's kind of cutting edge modern, right? And those problems in America, he loves the energy of America. I mean, there's so much going on there. But this is a guy who was like a published poet who had to work as a railway porter, something. And, the story of Langston Hughes, a waiter in a restaurant giving his work to what was the guy's name? Who wrote Vachel Lindsay, right? The guy who wrote that poem, The Congo. So he's taking his plates away, slips him some poems. Right? It's kind of sad in some ways, but I mean, these people, they lived life. They wrote it. It wasn't like there was. I think one of the things that McKay didn't like was this kind of ivory tower sort of thing. It was somebody, who is too effete and too kind of separated from the people, however you want to configure the people. He didn't want to be up here necessarily. I think he wanted his work read and respected, but he wanted to be with the kind of people he was writing with. I mean, this is relevant to somebody like Zora Neale Hurston too, who was not only a gifted artist but a trained anthropologist, who used the vernacular partly because she grew up among those people and that's what she was studying. And so I'm going to write about people, they're going to talk the way they really talk. They're not going to talk like artificial characters, in, let's say, a slave narrative that was narrated to some white amanuensis who wrote about dusty wenches and things like that. Words that blacks themselves never would have used. So it's a question of being able to sort of